Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity of being here this morning on one of the days when obviously our time management skills are not perhaps the greatest, but it still is nonetheless an opportunity to speak before on this floor, before you, Mr. Speaker, on a couple of issues that are significant. I appreciate also that I will be joined by my good friend from Texas who just spoke so eloquently about one of those who has given his all for all of us and how grateful we are for this family and this particular individual. I think we're going to be hitting several different themes this evening as we talk about the future of this country, especially as it deals with space. And here, once again, I'm very grateful that the gentleman from Texas is here because Mr. Olson has indeed been a leader in this particular issue in charting the future of America as far as space policy will be. It is very easy in this environment to try and focus, first of all, on jobs. And I think we will. Because indeed, as this particular administration is going to begin their Summer of Recovery tour, in which they will be touting the kinds of jobs that will be created to try and change the economic future this country is currently in, it seems almost ironic that administrative policies, especially within NASA, are going to create a vast amount of unemployed individuals. Up to 30,000 individuals who will receive their pink slips and be unemployed specifically because of policies initiated by this administration and the current leadership in NASA. It's at least ironic, but we will be talking about that. However, we want to go beyond that, because if you're dealing with simply jobs, that can be a very parochial issue. We're also dealing with the future of space and the importance of space. And clearly, if indeed this administration and the leaders of NASA today seem to be de-emphasizing the role of space in our future, other nations are not. The Russians, the Chinese, even the Indian government and the Japanese government have a unique interest in taking our position in the leadership role of space exploration. And that's another issue I think we will be talking about. I also want to make sure that we illustrate how sometimes there are unintended consequences in our actions. And this administration, once again, NASA's leadership, did not take into effect the consequences of their program changes and the consequences it would have specifically directed to our military preparedness. For indeed, one of the things we have to realize is that the component pieces that go into the missiles that shoot somebody to the moon are the same component pieces that go into missiles that shoot down rockets from our adversaries, from Iran or North Korea. And that if you harm the industrial base that creates one program, you harm the industrial base that creates the other program and gives us some pause to think what we're doing on the defense side of this country, which is clearly one of the few roles specifically given to Congress in the Constitution. Finally, I think I'd like to talk about a communique that came out from the administration today as to their future in space, and say that some of the platitudes that are very nicely written down in this communique are contradictory to the actions that indeed take place. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I think if the gentleman from Texas is prepared to lead off, I would like to turn as much time to Mr. Olson from Texas, who, as I said, has for quite a while been the organizer and the leader of this effort to try and explore what this administration is doing and maybe make some corrections, as is the role and responsibility of Congress dealing with space. And then I'll be happy to make some remarks after the gentleman from Texas is completed.
Well, I thank my colleague from Utah for allowing me to speak a little bit about on this incredibly important issue to our nation's future. 5 months ago, the Obama administration proposed NASA's budget for fiscal year 2011. The proposal included a surprisingly drastic decision, just out of the blue, to cancel the Constellation program, NASA's follow-on to the Space Shuttle. Constellation will provide a means and a service to utilize the International Space Station for as long as we need to, plus go beyond low Earth orbit, go to the moon and beyond. I believed at the time that such a dramatic reversal risked ceding American leadership in human spaceflight for the future. A lot has transpired since those 5 months, but I still believe canceling the Constellation presents more risks than rewards, creates more challenges than solutions, and raises more questions than it provides answers. The fact that NASA and the administration cannot or will not provide cogent, comprehensive details related to such a radical policy change should alarm every member of Congress. My colleagues and I remain concerned about our ability to maintain and utilize the International Space Station, the impact on the aerospace industrial base and our highly skilled workforce, as my colleague from Utah alluded to, and the financial, programmatic, and crew safety risk of reliance on unidentified commercial crew vehicles. These concerns have not been adequately addressed by the administration. And I've long supported a balanced program that combines Constellation with an increasing role for the commercial sector, beginning with cargo flights to the space station and over time evolving to crewed missions. And I will continue to do so. I'm not alone in advocating this balanced approach. As the heralded Augustine Commission report, when it was released, it says it's become, over time within the aerospace community, even the Augustine report did not advocate canceling the Constellation. I still believe that this balance exists between government and commercial space. It can exist, and within the budget that's been proposed. Both of these sectors have experienced tremendous successes over the past months, notably the Orion pad abort test in May and the Falcon 9 launch just last month. Yet, rather than focus on the vital elements to maintain American leadership in space, the administration and NASA are distracted with programs that seem to spend money on anything but space. Many of us are astonished by the misplaced priorities within NASA's budget. Instead of building and testing flight hardware, NASA proposes spending $1.9 billion to cancel Constellation contracts. Even now, NASA's selective enforcement of a termination liability provision for Constellation contracts is prematurely triggering layoffs across the country. It's been determined that somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 jobs could be lost nationwide as a result. And we're not just losing jobs, we're losing American know-how. We're losing capabilities and expertise that will be difficult and costly to get back if and when our nation decides that it wants to explore again. Our space program does not employ people. It invests in them. And by doing so, we strengthen our nation's security and our economic well-being. As if to add insult to injury, last Friday, the administration came forward with a request to transfer $100 million of NASA's already limited resources to the Labor and Commerce Departments to fund an interagency task force to spur, quote, regional economic growth and job creation. Our nation's best and brightest engineers and technicians don't want or need an interagency task force. They'd much rather retain and be put to use with their critical skills building and flying American-built spacecraft. The administration claims to have focused on jobs, 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 yet it fails to recognize the destructive impact of canceling Constellation and shifting $100 million to the Labor and Commerce Departments. So, as we look forward to the next 6 critical months, there are some things we must do. We must get answers from the administration. We in Congress must recognize the impact on our workforce and our infrastructure. We must pass an authorization bill. And perhaps most importantly, we must ensure that the final flights of the space shuttle and the continuous operation of the space station are done safely and successfully. I am both humbled and inspired that while men and women in our human spaceflight programs watch us debate and question whether jobs will exist, they continue to excel and drive our nation towards new achievements in space. Their focus, their sacrifice, their dedication, and that of the men and women who came before them have enabled the United States to be the global leader in human spaceflight. Let us work to keep it that way. I'd like to read if my colleague from Utah would let me. I just want to read just to show you how important it is to the American people and some of the people that are opposed to the administration's plan. This is the letter that ran in the Orlando Sentinel prior to the President's speech in Florida on April 15th. And I think it's worth reading just because our nation's experts and heroes in human spaceflight, this is how they feel about this administration's budget proposal. Dear President Obama, America is faced with the near simultaneous ending of the shuttle program and your recent budget proposal to cancel Constellation. This is wrong for our country for many reasons. We're very concerned about America ceding its hard-earned global leadership in space technology to other nations. We're stunned that, in a time of economic crisis, this move would force as many as 30,000 irreplaceable engineers and managers out of the space industry. We see our human exploration program, one of the most inspirational tools to promote science, technology, engineering, and math to our young people, being reduced to mediocrity. NASA's human space program has inspired awe and wonder in all ages by pursuing the American tradition of exploring the unknown. We strongly urge you to drop this misguided proposal that forces NASA out of human space operations for the foreseeable future. For those of us who have accepted the risk and dedicated a portion of our lives to the exploration of outer space, this is a terrible decision. Our experiences were made possible by the efforts of thousands who were similarly dedicated to the exploration of the last frontier. Success in this great national adventure was predicated on well-defined programs, an unwavering national commitment, and an ambitious challenge. We understand there are risks involved in spaceflight, but they are calculated risks for worthy goals whose benefits greatly exceeds those risks. America's greatness lies in her people. She will always have men and women willing to ride rockets into the heavens. America's challenge is to match their bravery and acceptance of risk with specific plans and goals worthy of their commitment. NASA must continue at the frontiers of human space exploration in order to develop technology and set the standards of excellence that will enable commercial space ventures to eventually succeed. Canceling NASA's human space operations after 50 years of unparalleled achievement makes that objective impossible. One of the greatest fears of any generation is not leaving things better for the young people of the next. In the area of human spaceflight, we're about to realize that fear. Your NASA budget proposal raises more questions about our future in space than it answers. Too many men and women have worked too hard and sacrificed too much to achieve America's preeminence in space, only to see that effort needlessly thrown away. We urge you to demonstrate the vision and determination necessary to keep our nation at the forefront of human space exploration with ambitious goals and the proper resources to see them through. This is not the time to abandon the promise of the space frontier for a lack of will or an unwillingness to pay the price. Sincerely, in the hopes of continued American leadership in human space exploration, the following people signed this letter. And it was signed by approximately 37 astronauts who span all of our main human spaceflight programs, from Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Skylab, Apollo-Soyuz, Shuttle, Station. This is a powerful argument, my friend, as to what we're doing. What we're doing here is wrong for our country's future. We need to develop the Constellation. We need to get beyond low Earth orbit, and we need to explore like Americans have been doing ever since our forefathers left their homes to come to this country.
I appreciate the gentleman from Texas, the points that he made, and especially the poignant letter that came out, and illustrating how the overwhelming majority, in fact, I'd say almost all but one, of our retired astronaut corps feels very strongly that Constellation was the right approach for this country to do, and that we should continue on with that particular approach. I'd like to go back through a couple of points. I hope I'm not redundant, but I think they're significant enough that even if we say them a second time, it's important. And I hope the gentleman from Texas would stay here and try and fill in the blanks where I miss those, if we could. there was a quick mention, once again, as we said, on the jobs that we were talking about here. The Vice President recently sent out a press release announcing that he was going on his summer tour to tout the Summer of Recovery. Now, amongst the things, the bullet points that they put in that press release was that this administration would be proposing programs to build up to 30,000 miles of new roads, up to 2,000 new water programs, up to 80,000 homes that might be weatherized, 800 jobs here, some there, asking this country to add a non-germane issue to the military supplemental to try and protect government worker jobs. And I just find that so ironic, as was mentioned, that at the same time we are doing that, the policies of this administration with regard to NASA contract jobs would take between 20 and 30,000 people who are part of the private sector, who are doing these jobs well, many of them being scientists and engineers, and they're basically giving them the pink slip. At the same time, we talk about how we're trying to build jobs in some other way. It simply does not compute that that is the way we're doing. I readily admit some of these jobs that are threatened and have been lost are personal friends and neighbors of mine. One personal friend who was one of those, I shared the picture with General Bolden, who's head of NASA, at one time in one of our committee meetings. 26 years dealing with procurement issues at one of the companies, just in his mid-50s, was just released simply because this is the policy of this particular administration. And I would love to be able to go to him and say, Ray, the reason that your job was terminated was because the government decided to try and save money. Problem is, none of these jobs that are going to be eliminated save the government a dime. In fact, it is true that this administration is asking for a $6 billion increase in NASA budget, even though they're going to be stopping the Space Man program and throwing up to 30,000 high-paid jobs who have proven their worth for years and years, throwing them out. There are some people that said, well, the new programs would create new jobs within NASA private sector relationship. Yet the most they're talking about there is maybe up to 10,000 jobs to be offset by the 30 we're losing. That's a 3-to-1 loss in the process that's there. For a fraction of that $6 billion of new additional money, above and beyond what we're already spending, to be focused directly on Constellation, we could continue this program to a successful conclusion. And once again, jobs I recognize are parochial. I'm part of that situation. But it seems ironic that in an era in which we're talking about jobs and job creation and more jobs and more job creation and realizing that we're never going to get out of this economic doldrums that we are in until we actually do have jobs, we as a government are having a policy to try and throw out 30,000 workers who have proven their net, who have proven their worth, and are moving this country forward. It just flat out does not make sense.
Yes, sir. If my colleague would yield. You're right, it absolutely doesn't make sense. And these just aren't some engineers who have just been doing it for a passing amount of time. These are the best in the world at what they do. These are the rocket scientists of America who've led our dominance in human spaceflight. They've been the best for 50 years. Having been a naval officer, one thing I can tell you in government agencies like NASA, like the military, you depend on your people to pass down their information to the young people coming up, the new generations, who take that information, who take that knowledge and exploit it and develop even better vehicles, better space exploration. We're going to lose that. These people are going to walk out the door and take that expertise with them. If we try to decide as a nation that we want to rebuild that at some point in the future, we're not going to be able to do it. Those people are going to be gone, and we're going to have to start over from scratch and teach a new generation of young Americans, learn the lessons we learned from going to the moon and spending all 6 months in orbit on the space station. We've learned those things. Unfortunately, and I agree with you on the terms of the priority of the budget. This is the second largest cut in the entire budget, the Constellation program. That is the largest cut. And so you figure, okay, if we're going to cut this money out of the budget, we're cutting the funding to the agency. No, as my colleague alluded to, we're giving $6 billion over a 5-year period to develop global warming research, to transition to these commercial launch vehicles. And I think our priorities are just wrong here. They're wrong for certainly our workforce, but they're wrong for America. One thing I'd like to mention too that's hard to put a dollar value on, but the ability of human spaceflight to inspire our youth to get these jobs, to become astronauts, and to pursue the American dream. I mean, I can tell you as a kid who grew up about 1.5 miles from the Johnson Space Center, whose Little League football coach was Joe Engle, the pilot of the second space shuttle. And just growing up in that environment, how much those men and women inspired us, my schoolmates, to want to be astronauts, to want to be part of that. And that still exists today. I see it all around my district. The administration doesn't seem to realize all the implications of killing this budget. We're killing 30,000 jobs, the best in the world at what they do. We're going to cede U.S. dominance in human spaceflight, give up some national security possibly, and we're going to lose the ability to inspire our youth. And I also must add, we don't give NASA enough credit for all the things they've developed for us back here on Earth. I mean, everybody here in this gallery has somehow benefited from NASA and their research up there. If you've got a cell phone, if you've got a satellite GPS, if you've got a pacemaker, some sort of medical device, that's come from NASA. That research has come from NASA, and we're going to throw that away with this budget. And that's why we're working very hard to stop it. Now, I wish the administration would just sit down and talk with us, because, Mr. President, you have a voice, but you don't have the final word. The United States Congress, under the United States Constitution, has the final word.
I appreciate the gentleman from Texas, if I could reclaim the time briefly, from changing from just the concept of jobs into indeed the future of space, and especially to putting the emphasis on the fact that what are we going to do to inspire people to go into science and math and becoming the engineers of the future. Let's face it, if you only build one new plane for our military once every 40 years, or if we're only doing one new adventure into space once every 30 years, that doesn't inspire somebody. In fact, one of the NASA's goals, supposedly new goals, is to try to encourage education into space. And I think, as the gentleman from Texas clearly cited, kids are not dumb, and they're realizing if you're at a whim firing 30,000 engineers and scientists, that doesn't give you a whole lot of encouragement to trying to move in that particular area. One of the issues especially is because Constellation is the cutting edge of science. It was granted last year by Time magazine as one of the 50 best inventions of the year. In fact, it was the #1 of the 50 best inventions of last year. And it shows that what we are doing is right. This is the right approach, and this is the approach that is being threatened by the policies of this administration and the current NASA leadership. Space Shuttle had a couple of very sad disasters. In the last one, there was a study made on how to avoid that in the future. And they said the most important thing we can do, and I think every astronaut understands this, which is maybe why so many of them signed that particular letter to which the gentleman from Texas read, is 2 goals. NASA will never be effective if, #1, the safety of our astronauts is the most primary and utmost position, and #2, you have a clear, understandable, and stated goal, what we are trying to accomplish. It is true that during the Bush administration, we decided to halt the Space Shuttle program. It had run its course. We have been able to be very successful in going to the space station and back, but there were some issues that we needed to go beyond simply Space Shuttle. So the effort was made to try and put our best minds together and see where we could go into the future that would meet those 2 goals, a clear statement of purpose and safety. And the reality of that was Constellation. This is the safety concept. This Constellation program is designed to be safer than the Space Shuttle by a factor of 10. It was recognized that if you want to try and stop some of the catastrophes we've had today, you separate the cargo from the passengers. That's what Orion does in that process, allows a safety valve for the safety of the passengers, in this case the astronauts that would be. And in addition, we clearly realized that we needed to go with solid rocket propellant because it is much safer than liquid propellant. Perhaps not as powerful, but certainly much more controllable. And once again, the concept of safety is important. This is the future if you really care about astronauts. And the second one was the goal is very clear. The design was for a specific goal. The intent was for a specific goal. And I don't want to be disparaging to this administration, but the apparent goal of this administration with spaceflight is someday, maybe, perhaps, at some time, we might land on some asteroid somewhere. That's not a specific goal. That's not even a dream. That's not even a reality that we can deal with. That may be almost cartoonish in the approaches to deal with it. And unfortunately, if we start scaling back, other countries are not. The Russians are still involved. The Chinese are stepping up their involvement in space exploration. As I said earlier, even the Indian government and the Japanese government has stated that they have a plan in mind to try and become involved in this concept. What becomes so bizarre is the United States that won the space race is now forfeiting the space future to other countries. We had a plan between the actual startup of Constellation, which is both the Ares rocket and the Orion space capsule, and the end of the space shuttle, in which the Russians would have to do some of the taxi service for us. They would charge us somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $35 million per ride, which is a large amount of money. But however, our good friends in Russia, after they left communism, have found capitalism to their liking, and they realize what a monopoly gives them the power to do. In the 2011 budget, NASA wants to budget $75 million per astronaut ride from Earth up to the space station and back. Now that's the kind of cost that's coming to the taxpayers of the United States, and I would once again maybe be willing to accept it if that was moving America forward. But simply subsidizing the Russian space program instead of building our own program is not what I call smart use of moving us into the future. In fact, we simply have said that this summer of recovery should be the summer of the Russian and Chinese recovery. We will be subsidizing their missile program, their space exploration program, at the tune of $75 million every time we send an American astronaut into space on Russian technology to help their program out, to keep their jobs going. And I'm sorry, that just does not make sense.
Yes, sir.
As to where our future should be.
My colleague yield?
I would be happy to yield.
Thank you. I want to get back to your point about being a goal, having some sort of focus. I'm a Rice University graduate, and we had the honor of President Kennedy coming to our school in the early 60s to make his famous speech where he said, you know, we're going to go to the moon, take a man to the moon, and return by the end of this decade. That was a clear goal. Here's our goal. Here's what we're going to do it in. We're going to give you the resources to do it. And when I go home, when I go back to my district, the one thing I hear from both the government employees and the contractors at NASA are, what's our goal? I mean, what are we doing? What's our target? We're going to go to Mars sometime by 2035 or somewhere in that window. We're going to take 5 years to develop design and make designs for a heavy lift vehicle. Then we're going to build that 5 years from now. That's not what makes NASA great. You give these people a goal. Give them a time frame and give them the resources they need to do it. They will do it. Every time in our history, they've made some of the greatest technological advancements that mankind will ever know. And again, this administration's budget priorities has nothing to do with that. And again, the ability it has to inspire our kids. The thing we've gotten into with the Russians now, where we're going to have to depend on them to take our astronauts up to and from the space station. And as my colleague alluded to, you can say what you want about our former communist friends, but they have figured out capitalism in a very short time. And you know, we were paying about just over $20 million per seat last year. That price has gone up now to just a little over 50. We signed a contract, I believe, through 2014, and it's doubtful, certainly with the administration's budget proposal, that we'll have an American vehicle that can transport us to the space station. We're going to have to renegotiate that contract. And as my colleague from Utah alluded to, that thing's probably going to double again. This is just a terrible position we've gotten ourselves into. We need Constellation is the program of record, been endorsed by a Republican Congress in 2005, a Democrat Congress in 2008. We need to develop Constellation and stay the course and let our engineers and let our space experts and let our astronauts do what they do to inspire youth.
If I could reclaim the time, and I appreciate that comment, and once again, the fact we're throwing at different numbers about what it will cost to send Americans up there is simply because NASA doesn't know what it will cost, and that's why they're budgeting very high. Who knows if that is the actual number? Because once again, The Russians realize when they have a monopoly, they can charge what they want to charge. Let's deal with another phrase that we often hear from this administration. They are about to commercialize space. I want to try and put that one to rest if we could. There is no such thing as privatizing or commercializing what we are doing in space. The Constellation program is being built by private enterprise. They were contracts let by this government that were done on a competitive bid process and won by private sectors, by the private sector, by commercial companies. Which means when we cut Constellation, we're not cutting a government program, we're cutting 30,000 jobs in the private sector to build a contract that comes from here. What the president and the NASA leaders were talking about when they say, well, we're going to commercialize the future of space, is not really changing the philosophy of what we're doing. All they're doing is they're going to take the contracts from those who have them now building Constellation, fire those people, and then we will give some of that extra NASA money that we're going to be appropriating to other companies in the private sector who are going to be winners in the values that this administration places on those particular companies. In fact, the companies that are talking about this so-called commercialization of space already are under contract with NASA. They are already being subsidized by NASA. They are already behind in their programs with NASA, and they are asking for more federal dollars for NASA. So once again, I oftentimes hear, well, this is an administration that wants to totally change the way we deal with space, and they want to try and commercialize everything. That's a cute word. But the reality is, you're simply having some people in the private sector who will lose their jobs, so the administration can pick other people in the private sector to have jobs, and not necessarily on a one-to-one ratio. There is no such thing as commercialization of space or these programs. And we are not trying to come up with a free enterprise approach to the future of space. This is simply the government picking winners and losers amongst a lot of people who are out there in the private sector. 30,000 jobs are going to be lost are not government jobs. Those are private sector jobs.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. My colleague from Utah makes a great point if he yield for a little time. Certainly the commercial has a place in our future, but they're not anywhere near being ready to do what this administration wants them to do. Carry cargo to the space station. They're not there yet. They've had one launch. That's a long, long way to go from being able to carry cargo up to and from the space station. More importantly, astronauts, human beings, that is a much, much greater challenge than carrying cargo, and they've got a long way to go. When I talk to experts back home, they say a decade would be a good number for the commercial operators to have man-rated vehicles. And they've got a long, long way to go. And one thing I'm concerned about is safety. As my colleague from Utah alluded to earlier tonight, safety is paramount. I mean, we need to do what we've done at NASA the 50 years they've been in existence. They have put safety of astronauts as the #1 concern. And it's a very, very risky endeavor that they do. And we've got to make sure that safety is put first. And that's one of my concerns with these commercial operators. Again, as my colleague alluded to, economically, it's no different than what we're doing now. But it concerns me that we're going to have people who don't understand the safety that's required. And they think that they can, just because they get cargo to the station, they can get crew to the station. Wrong. You have to there's so much more to carry a crew to a space, up and to and from the space station. You've got to ensure they're safe. You've got to have the redundancy to the redundancy to the redundancy to the backup system to ensure that if anything happens to that vehicle, from the time it pulls off that pad till the time it gets to the station and comes back down, that the crew has the ability to get home safely. And I'm concerned it's one thing that this president's budget proposal doesn't take into account.
I appreciate that, and reclaiming the time once again. I'm glad we're talking about the fact that these are real people in the job market that we're going to be harming. I'm glad we're talking about the overall purpose of our space exploration program and what it means to them. I'm glad the gentleman ticked off a bunch of areas. And I mean, let's face it, when my kids were growing up, the fact that I could put their shoes on with Velcro was a major advantage than trying to tie their shoes. We have those examples in our life. I'm glad that we're talking about the fact that Constellation is the future. It is the best science that we have. It is the safest way of going forward. And I'm glad we're talking about the fact that we're not, this entire idea that we're going to privatize our space program, which has caught the fancy of some of our colleagues who aren't really perhaps deeply involved in the science committee, as the gentleman from Texas is, to realize that's not what we're talking about here. All we're talking about is, once again, government picking winners and losers amongst the private sector to go on with programs that will still be